Okay, welcome back to part 2 of leadership. In this video, we're going to talk about some of the more contemporary approaches to leadership. In our first video, we looked at some of the earlier approaches, such as trait theory, the behavioral approaches, and some of the original situational theories. We're going to move on and we're going to look at some new ideas which are probably still very current, are still receiving some attention, some research energy. If you look in the leadership literature, you'll see that these ideas are still being very much discussed, and some of them are even more emerging, kind of cutting edge. We still don't know a whole lot about them, but we think they're important, and so therefore scholars are putting a lot of time and energy into understanding them. So, without any further ado, let's look at some of the more contemporary approaches to leadership. Now, by the way, in case some of you are thinking that your professor has lost his marbles, I haven't lost them. They're all right here. Okay, anyhow, where was I? Now, the first contemporary situational theory we're going to look at is something called leader-member exchange, right? Or LMX, one of the coolest acronyms in all the OB literature, LMX. I just love LMX just because of the cool acronym, all right? But it stands for leader-member exchange. And this model suggests that leaders form unique, independent relationships with each of their subordinates, and that a key factor in the nature of this relationship is whether the individual subordinate is in the leader's in-group or out-group. Now, you've probably all experienced this before, haven't you? Where there's some leaders that you kind of feel like you're on the in, you know, you're close, you do things together, you're kind of in the same mind, maybe even like hang out socially together or play golf or get together, you know. You're probably part of that leader's in-group. And then there's other leaders where you just feel like, it's just kind of hard to break in, you know. There's other people that he or she seems to be closer to. We don't really do anything other than the formal, you know, work things that we're supposed to do. And so this would be an example of being on the out group, right? So sometimes we're in the in group and sometimes we're in the out group. And being on the in group is really, it affords the followers much more trust and insight, and typically in-group people are more motivated, right? They're more committed, they're more loyal to the organization and to the leader. As we're out-group people are not, they don't receive the same kind of trust, they're not quite as committed, and they don't have the same sort of insight. Now, why is this important? It's important for several reasons. As a leader, you have to understand that when you choose to include people or exclude people, what you are doing in terms of their commitment to the organization, right? So the next sort of logical step of this idea of LMX is what's called leader making. And it's this idea that, that we want to be intentional, yes, I can say that word. We want to be intentional about bringing people into our in-group and giving them more confidence and trust, because guess what? If we do that, then we will develop their leadership ability because they have been entrusted and empowered by the leader. They know what's going on. They have more insight. They have more of a sense of concern about the organization, right? So you want to develop people that share your passion and concern for the organization. And so the way you do that, one of the ways you do that is by helping to bring them into the in-group so that they can share that insight and passion with you. The next contemporary situational theory is called the Hersey-Blanchard model. Now, I know it looks like Hershey, but it really has nothing to do with chocolate or anything. It's Hersey. And this approach suggests that leaders' behavior should vary in response to the readiness of their followers. Okay? So, in other words, this is similar to the situational theory before, but it says that the situation that's different is the maturity level of the follower. And the maturity level of the follower is based on two criteria. It is based on their skill ability, right? Whether they actually have the relevant skills to accomplish something, and their psychological maturity, whether or not they have the confidence and the motivation to do something, right? Okay, so remember earlier I said that in the leadership grid model, they thought initially that high was ideal, right? That we wanted to be high people and we wanted to be high on task, right? And that made you the quote-unquote team leader. Well, what this model says is that you don't want to always be high because depending on the maturity level of the follower, that's when you need to change it up. So if the maturity level of the follower is low, relatively low, then you want to be more task oriented, right? You need to tell them what to do. You need to show them how to do things. Now, on the other hand, if the follower is more mature, if they have the confidence to do it, they have the skills and experience, then you want to be more kind of high. Then you can delegate more. You can be more focused on tasks. In fact, this model would even suggest for somebody who's high, that's when you stand back and you really you're more of a consulting role. Okay, so there's these different levels here. They calls it telling, selling, participating, and delegating, right? So for an immature person, then you're telling. A little more mature, you're selling. A little more mature, but they lack the confidence. Maybe they've lost the confidence, then you're participating. And if they're fully mature, then you're delegating, and your task behavior really should diminish over time. So let's talk about some of these more contemporary approaches, what the textbook calls leadership through the eyes of the followers. Now, the first three that we're going to look at are what are called transformational leadership, charismatic leadership, and this idea of attributions of leadership. Now, transformational leadership got a lot of traction back in the 90s and the 2000s. It's really started off by a guy named Burns, who wrote the authoritative book on leadership called, surprisingly, Leadership. And Burns said that there was these certain kinds of leaders that not only did they exercise good management, did they control and all those kinds of things, but they were able to literally transform their followers. And not only that, they were influenced, and transformed by their followers. Transformational leadership is kind of a mutual transformational process. It's not just a one-way street, right? And so transformational leadership has to do with really engaging followers and helping change and challenge their thinkings and sentiments. And in the process, you are entering into a community, to a collaborative process with those followers as well, so you are likewise transformed. Now, the book describes it as the set of abilities that allows a leader to recognize the need for change, to create a vision to guide that change, and to execute that change effectively. All right, so now as we start talking about leadership, this idea of vision and change start to become much more prevalent in the literature. Right. Now, the next idea is this idea of charismatic leadership. And the book describes charisma as a personal characteristic of the leader which inspires support and acceptance. Leadership is based on the leader's personal charisma. Now, Max Weber, a 19th century Prussian sociologist, said this. He said it's the most unstable form of legitimate leadership or authority. And so when you think about great leaders of the past, people heroic, larger-than-life kinds of leaders, typically they were attributed charisma by their followers. People saw them as larger than life. Now, in the church, we talk about charisma, don't we? We talk about charisma sort of as a Pentecostal manifestation. You know, we're charismatic, we speak in tongues or whatever. But this isn't the same kind of thing. It's the same root, right? Charis, this idea of a gift from above. And so charismatic leaders were these larger than life. They seem like their leadership was their destiny in life, and they're able to accomplish great things. Now, we know there's a negative side to charismatic leadership too, right? Some charismatic leaders are very narcissistic. It's all about them. It's all about their organization. They're very myopic. People tend not to speak up against the charismatic leader, right, for fear of retribution or fear of being castigated or, considered an outsider. So there's kind of a downside to charismatic leadership as well. It's very hard to control. You can't control a charismatic leader. You just can't do it. The only way to control them is by booting them out of the organization or the country or whatever. So It was thought actually at one point too, it was kind of a fad to get a charismatic leader as your CEO. And in time they did research on the effectiveness of these leaders, and guess what? They weren't any more effective than non-charismatic leaders, right? So, but again, this is such a, I don't know, kind of a conventional wisdom way of thinking about leadership. I think when most people think about leaders, they're sort of thinking of these larger than life, charismatic figures, people that just seem to have this gift, right? So anyhow, charismatic leadership, very important. Now the next approach here is what's called the attributions of leadership. It holds that when behaviors are observed in a context associated with leadership, others may attribute it varying levels of leadership ability or power to the person displaying those behaviors. All right, so this idea of attribution really says that leadership is in the eye of the beholder, and so therefore it can vary from situation to situation, from culture to culture. You know, some cultures see leaders differently. Some organizations see leaders differently, right? Some organization, if it's like a kind of an engineering organization, they're going to see like a smart engineer as a leader. If it's a kind of a political organization, they're going to see the most persuasive, the person who's really able to bash their enemies the best. They're really going to be attributed leadership. So its attribution is contextualized, it's contextually sensitive to the followers. And this whole idea of attribution is important too, because it says that leadership isn't a real quality that exists in a person, but rather it is what the followers perceive about the person. Okay, so there's certain things that in certain cultures make followers attribute leadership to them. So it's a very important concept to understand, this kind of leadership through the eyes of the follower. A couple of other interesting ideas are emerging in the leadership literature. One, they're called alternatives to leadership. And so there's something called leadership substitutes and leadership neutralizers. Now, what's a leadership substitute? Well, sometimes in a context, an organization, leadership doesn't have to reside in a single person. The ideals, the ethos, the vision, the passion simply are embedded in the culture of that organization. And so it's not as critical for leadership to reside in a single person. So for example, individual substitutes and neutralizers could be things like individual professionalism. Hey, we know what our job is. We know what the gig is. We don't need a person to tell us what it is. Our personal motivation, our personal experience and training, indifference to rewards, right? So some of these things that leaders typically provide, like motivation, rewards, these things reside in us. We don't need those rewards. We have our own motivation. We're professional. And so therefore leadership is not quite as critical in order to get people aligned and motivated and influence whatnot. There can be job substitutes, right? Like the structure of the job itself, jobs that are highly controlled, that are intrinsically satisfying, that have embedded feedback. So when a job has these characteristics, leadership isn't quite as important. Group norms and group cohesiveness also can be seen as a substitute for leadership. And organization, rigid procedures and rules, explicit goals and objectives, and rigid reward system. All right, another emerging idea is this idea that leaders are coaches, right? The best way to help your subordinates to be their coach. And so this idea that leaders serve as leaders, as mentors and coaches is becoming important. Another emerging area in the leadership literature has to do with gender and leadership. All right, so no surprise that because men and women are different, right, that perhaps leadership, the way they lead and the issues concerned to women in leadership are much different. Now, again, we could do a whole class, I could do a whole session on this, and I encourage you, if you're very interested in the differences between men and women, to study up. There's some great books out there. Alice Eagley probably wrote one of the definitive books on this. It's called Through the Labyrinth. And her premise is this, is that, you know, once upon a time they called it the glass ceiling, right? That women couldn't break through the glass ceiling. Well, she kind of comes up with a new metaphor for the challenges women face. And it's not so much that there's a ceiling here, but it's more that they're running through a maze and there's lots of obstacles and challenges to women becoming leaders than for men. Now, of course, the most obvious one that we all think of is bias, right, and stereotype, because some people are biased against women, that women are stereotyped, that women are supposed to be nice, they're supposed to be friendly, and so women come into what's called this double bind. When they're too nice and they're too friendly, people don't take them seriously. And when they're too firm and they're too man-like, they're too authoritative, people start calling them other nasty words, all right? So, and I'll let you use your imagination what those words are. So women have a challenge, right, in finding, not being, the caring, gushing mom versus being the strict, rigid, authoritarian figure, right? So that doesn't work for women either. So this is a challenge. Plus the other challenges that women face are things like family. Women have a stronger sense of commitment for taking care, being the primary caregiver for their children, as where men don't. And this is more of a cultural norm too, right? Where women are expected to stay home, take care of the kids, provide nurture for their kids, and they might even have to step out of work for a while to do that, right? To have children, to nurture them, to spend time with the kids, it means you have to step out, where men don't have to do that. So that's another obstacle. Women don't typically network quite as well. They don't promote themselves the same way that men do. So this is another challenge. So it's this labyrinth idea. There's all these obstacles that hinder women from advancing. Now, the upside is that it's been proven that women have a lot of characteristics that lead to good leadership. Remember, we talked about transformational leadership. It's been shown that women naturally have more transformational kinds of characteristics. For example, this individualized consideration one, right? Women are just a little more concerned about the people side of leadership, and so this comes across, and this helps them to be more transformational. Women tend to be more participative and inclusive, right, in terms of their leadership style. So there's a lot of upside. There's a lot of ways that women provide leadership that are conducive to what we know about good leadership. Cross-cultural leadership is another important emerging area, and I think it was in chapter 2 we actually looked at Hofstede, and I encourage you to go back and look at Hofstede's model. So that about does it. Man, we covered a lot of stuff. We just covered about 100 years of thinking and theorizing about leadership just in a little over half an hour. I hope you appreciated this. Again, sink your teeth into the textbook. Go over some of these more difficult to understand ideas like the decision tree and the situational model and contingency leadership, least preferred coworker. Make sure you really understand some more of the contemporary approaches like transformational leadership, like charisma and leadership substitutes and strategic leadership, and what are the issues with women in leadership and cross-cultural leadership. It's all important stuff, you guys. It really is. And again, you can probably tell I get a little fired up about this topic. This is my area. This is my background. And the reason I think I'm so impassioned, why I think this is so important, because I really understand, I really believe that leaders make the difference in successful organizations, right? And while we believe in leadership substitutes, somebody at some point has to raise the standard. Somebody has to cast the vision. Somebody has to motivate other people. And so it doesn't happen without effective leadership. And so I believe, to me, this is my strategic mission in life, is to help people understand about leadership, how they can become more effective leaders so that they can lead organizations that are effective in impacting, not just to make money or make a buck, but to really be representatives of Christ, right? We want to be good Christian leaders, that we exemplify the values of the kingdom so that people know we're different. Right? We didn't even talk about servant leadership in this approach either, but that's another emerging, important idea, not just from Scripture, but guys like Greenleaf have really studied what it is to be a servant leader. How do we effectively serve other people so that they become great, so that we have organizations that are empowered, right? It's not just about us, but we have lots of people who are empowered, who are served, and themselves are serving other people. This is a Christ-like model of leadership, I believe, is very important for us to understand and to model and to grow in. Anyhow, that's about all I'm going to say for that. God bless you guys. I look forward to interacting with you all online, and have a great week.